My antennae went flat the instant the classroom door opened, and for 3 full heartbeats I did not understand why. Nothing had changed. The air pressure held steady. The thermal gradient across the room stayed within its normal variance. Professor Kavalin was mid-sentence, his forearms gesturing through a molecular diagram projected above his desk, and 31 students sat in their usual configurations across the tiered seating of Lecture Hall 9. Everything was exactly as it had been 2 seconds before, except now, standing in the doorway, there was a creature that had not been there a moment ago, and my antennae had not detected it arrive. That was the first wrong thing. I am Valesi. My species evolved on a world where silence meant death, where the only organisms that moved without sound were the ones planning to eat you. Every Valesi is born with antennae that read air displacement, thermal radiation, vibration through solid surfaces, and the faintest chemical traces carried on moving atmosphere. I can feel an instructor walking down a hallway 40 meters away. I can feel the heartbeat of the Grolak boy sitting next to me through the bench we share, the thick hydraulic thump of his oversized cardiovascular system, pushing blood through a body that outweighs mine by a factor of 6. I can feel dust settling on the floor after a door closes. I had not felt this creature open the door. She stood there in the frame of it, small by the standards of most species in the room, shorter than the Grolak boy, and narrower than even me. She carried a fabric container over one shoulder, and her body was wrapped in layered textiles of muted color, dark blue and gray. 2 legs, 2 arms, a head set directly atop a short neck with no protective ridge or carapace. Her skin was a pale pinkish tone, smooth, entirely without plates or scales or any visible defense structure. Her hair, a dark brown mass of thin filaments, was gathered behind her head in a simple binding. She looked, by every metric I had been taught to evaluate, like a prey species. Soft, slow, exposed. Then she looked at the room, and I felt the second wrong thing. Her eyes moved before her head did. Not by much. Not in a way that anyone who was not watching closely would catch. But I was watching, because my antennae were still flat and screaming at me that something was off, and I saw it clearly. Her eyes swept left to right across the entire seating arrangement in a fraction of a second, cataloging positions and distances, and only after they had completed their scan did her head turn to follow. It was a movement I had seen exactly once before, in a predator behavior simulation during second-year xenobiology. Ambush species tracked with their heads. Endurance species tracked with their bodies. Only pursuit predators tracked with their eyes first, and let their skull follow. Because for a pursuit predator, the head was not a sensor platform, it was a weapon mount. The eyes did the finding. The head aimed what came next. Professor Kavalin stopped his lecture and looked toward the door. His expression shifted to something carefully neutral, the kind of face instructors make when they have been briefed on something they do not fully agree with. "Class," he said, "this is our new exchange student. She will be joining us for the remainder of the term as part of the integration program. Please make her welcome." He said her name. Lena Vasic. She was human. I had heard the species mentioned in passing, a recent contact from a world somewhere in the mid-spiral, but the details had been sparse in the educational feeds. New species joined the broader galactic community every few decades. It was not unusual. What was unusual was the way Professor Kavalin's rear pair of arms stayed pressed tight against his thorax as he spoke, the Tavellan equivalent of a clenched jaw. Lena Vasic smiled. It was a small expression, just the corners of her mouth pulling upward, exposing no teeth, and several students in the front row smiled back at her reflexively before catching themselves. I watched the Grolak boy beside me, Dorvan, lean toward her with the easy confidence of someone who had never been smaller than anything in his life. Then, without any visible trigger, he leaned back. His neck frill, that heavy ring of cartilage that Grolak males flare when they are asserting dominance, stayed clamped tight against his throat. Lena was directed to an empty seat. She walked to it. I listened to her footsteps, or tried to. She was wearing soft-soled coverings on her feet, and even accounting for that, the sound she produced while moving across a hard composite floor was so minimal that I had to focus my antennae directly at her lower body to pick it up. She moved the way still water moves, displacing almost nothing. Every joint in her body seemed to absorb its own impact before the vibration could reach the ground. That was not training. That was not technique. That was 10,000 generations of selection pressure from a world where making noise while you moved meant something with bigger teeth heard you first. She sat down. She placed her bag on the floor. She folded her hands on the desk surface and looked at Professor Kovalin with an expression of polite attention, and I realized that I had been holding my breath equivalent for nearly 30 seconds. The lecture resumed. I did not hear a word of it. During the first break period, I accessed the Academy's Student Information Network from my personal terminal and searched for Lena Vasik's species file. What I found, or more accurately what I did not find, made the flat antenna feeling worse. Her homeworld was listed as Earth. Classification, pending review. That alone was strange. Every species that entered the integration program had a full planetary profile available to students, because the entire point of integration was mutual understanding. You cannot integrate if you do not know what you are integrating with. But Earth's file was a wall of redacted fields. Atmospheric composition, restricted. Predator-to-prey species ratio, restricted. Tectonic activity index, restricted. Evolutionary origin of dominant species, withheld by Integrations Board. The only field that was fully visible, open and unqualified, was the dietary classification of the incoming student. It read, omnivore, adaptive. I stared at those two words for longer than I should have. Omnivore was not unusual. Many species consumed both plant and animal matter. But the word adaptive was not a dietary classification. It was a warning label. It meant the organism in question did not have a fixed diet. It meant it could eat whatever was available. It meant it did not need specific nutrition to survive. It would simply consume whatever its environment provided, process it, extract what it needed, and keep moving. That was not a trait of a prey species. That was the trait of something that could not afford to be selective, because it was always on the hunt. I closed the file and went to the dining hall for the midday nutrition period. The hall was busy, hundreds of students from dozens of species, arranged in loose clusters by comfort and compatibility. The Grullic herd occupied their usual corner, their heavy bodies crowded around reinforced tables. The Skirith ambush predator students ate alone, as they preferred, each one occupying a separate table with their backs to the wall. The various insectoid and avian species, my own people among them, filled the middle rows in mixed groups. Lena Vasik sat alone. She had a tray of food in front of her, items selected from the omnivore station, and she was eating with an unhurried calm that suggested she was either unaware of or unbothered by the empty seats surrounding her. I watched from 4 tables away, telling myself I was simply observing, that my xenobiology training encouraged field observation of unfamiliar species. It was not entirely a lie. She picked up a piece of fruit from her tray. A malaloc fruit, imported from Tavellan Prime, thick-skinned and dense. Most species used a cutting tool to open them. Lena held it in one hand, pressed the thumb of her other hand against the rind, and peeled the skin away in a single continuous strip. The rind was 3 millimeters thick. It was rated as a Class 4 material hardness. She removed it with her bare fingers, with the blunt, flat nails at the tips of her digits, and she did it without effort, without strain, without any indication that she was doing something that should not have been possible for a creature her size. The thin membrane split under pressure that her soft, unarmored hands should not have been able to generate, and she ate the fruit inside one segment at a time, looking out the window at the academy grounds as if nothing interesting was happening. Nobody else watched her do this. The hall was loud and busy, and everyone was focused on their own conversations and their own food. I was the only one who saw a small, soft, quiet creature casually demonstrate a grip strength that exceeded her apparent physical capability by at least 2 classifications. I went back to my quarters that evening and pulled up the only publicly accessible research paper on Earth's biosphere. It was 6 pages long. It had been authored by a 3-member survey team from the Galactic Biological Assessment Division, and large portions of it had been redacted since initial publication, the black bars of classified information, covering what I suspected were the most important sections. But what remained was enough. Earth's gravity index was listed as 1.0 G standard. That number sat on my screen, and I read it 4 times. The galactic median for worlds that produced sapient life was 0.6 G. Earth was nearly double. That meant everything on that planet, every organism, every structure, every moving thing, existed under a gravitational load that would slowly crush most galactic species over the course of a standard year. And the creatures that evolved there did not merely tolerate it. They thrived, they ran, they jumped, they built cities and climbed mountains, and swam through liquid water that weighed more per unit volume than the construction fluid used to pour foundation slabs on Velesi Prime. One sentence in the paper caught me, and I read it until the words burned themselves into my memory. It described the hunting method of early humans, before they developed technology, before tools and fire, and the long chain of invention that eventually carried them to the stars. The sentence read, "Persistence predation over multi-day pursuit windows." I did not need to look up what that meant. I understood it immediately, and the understanding sat in my thorax like a stone. They chased things, not in bursts, not in ambush sprints, not with the explosive speed and retreat pattern of every predator species I had ever studied. They picked a target and they followed it. They followed it when it ran. They followed it when it hid. They followed it over hills and across rivers and through temperature extremes that should have forced a rest cycle. And they kept following until the prey animal, faster and stronger and better armed than the creature pursuing it, simply stopped. Not because it chose to, because its body could not run anymore, because nothing on that planet had evolved the ability to run forever, except the humans. I set the document down. I looked at my ceiling. I thought about Lena Vasic peeling fruit skin off with her fingernails, and the silence of her footsteps, and the way her eyes moved before her head, and the single word, adaptive, next to her dietary classification. I did not sleep that night. In the morning, I went back to class, and she was already in her seat, her bag on the floor, her hands folded, her expression warm and open and completely, terrifyingly unreadable. She looked at me when I walked in and gave me that small smile, the one that showed no teeth, the one that was designed to be harmless. I smiled back because my body responded before my mind could intervene. Then I sat down 3 rows behind her and watched the back of her head and tried to convince myself that the integration board knew what they were doing, that there was a reason they had placed a pursuit predator from a high-gravity Deathworld in a classroom full of species that had never needed to run from anything in their evolutionary history. I could not convince myself, but the semester had only just begun, and Lena Vasic was sitting 3 rows ahead of me, quiet and polite and still as deep water, and I could not look away. The chemical laboratory session 2 days later began like every other. Professor Kavalin distributed the equipment trays, recited the safety protocols, and assigned us to paired workstations. I was partnered with a Skirith student named Teskal, whose 4 compound eyes made him an excellent observer for precision work, but whose ambush predator temperament made him a terrible conversationalist. We had an understanding. He watched the reactions. I took the notes. Neither of us spoke unless the experiment required it. Lena Vasic was paired with Dorvan. They worked at the station directly across the aisle from mine, close enough that I could track both of them in my peripheral antennae without turning my head. Dorvan handled the heavy equipment, the reinforced flasks, and the magnetic stirrers, while Lena measured reagents into smaller vessels. They spoke to each other in short, functional sentences. Dorvan had settled into a cautious friendliness around her over the past 2 days. The kind of warmth you offer someone when your instincts are telling you one thing and your social training is telling you another. He was trying. She made it easy for him. She laughed at his jokes. She asked about his homeworld. She told him about something called snow, frozen water falling from the sky, and he reacted with such open amazement that she laughed again, and for a moment, the laboratory felt normal. Then the glass broke. It was a pipette, a standard-issue graduated glass tube used for precise liquid transfer. Every species in the room used them daily. They were rated for a Class 6 grip strength, well above the maximum for any species enrolled in the introductory chemistry track. Lena was holding one, measuring out a reagent, and her fingers tightened around it by some fractional degree that would have been completely insignificant for any other student in the room. The pipette did not crack. It shattered. The glass collapsed inward under her grip and fragmented, and a shard of it sliced across her palm in a clean diagonal line. The sound was small, a brief crunch and tinkle of falling glass, and Lena said a single word in her own language. It was clearly a mild expression of discomfort, the kind of thing you say when you stub a toe, not when you open a wound on your hand. She looked at her palm. A line of red fluid was already welling from the cut, bright and vivid against her pale skin. She reached for a cloth on the workstation, pressed it against the wound, and began wrapping it around her hand with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. That was when the smell hit the room. My antennae registered it before my conscious mind processed what I was sensing. A molecular signature, complex and metallic, carried on the warm air of the laboratory. I decoded it automatically, the way my species decodes every chemical trace in our environment, and the result arrived in my awareness like a cold hand closing around my thorax. Iron. Free-floating, hemoglobin-bound iron. The fluid coming out of Lena Vasic's hand was not merely red. It was red because it was saturated with iron, the same element that was used in industrial smelting, in military hull construction, in the high-tensile structural alloys that held warship bulkheads together under combat stress. That element, that metal, was dissolved in her blood. It was circulating inside her body. It was, at this very moment, exposed to open air, and the molecules were dispersing through the laboratory atmosphere with the easy efficiency of something that was designed to carry oxygen across a high-gravity world. 3 students collapsed almost simultaneously. A pylori in the front row, a species with chemoreceptor tendrils so sensitive they could taste the composition of a room by standing in it, went rigid and fell sideways off her stool. Her tendrils had locked straight out from her skull in a posture I had only seen in textbook diagrams, the involuntary predator proximity alarm that evolution had built into her species as a last-ditch survival response. She was unconscious before she hit the floor. 2 seats behind her, a Velith male, small and quick-bodied, began vomiting with violent immediacy, his digestive system rejecting its contents in a panic response triggered by the chemical signature of a biological compound that, on his homeworld, was associated exclusively with apex predators. And at the end of the front row, a Tavellan student named Creven, a quiet boy who had never spoken to Lena or anyone else with particular intensity, froze in his seat and began clicking. The sound was sharp and rapid, a distress call encoded in his species since before they developed language, a sound that meant one thing in every Tavellan dialect across every Tavellan world: something dangerous is here, and it is close, and it is too late to run. The laboratory erupted into controlled panic. Students pushed back from their stations. Voices overlapped in 6 languages. Professor Kavalin shouted for calm, his 4 arms spreading wide in the Tavellan gesture of authority and reassurance. And through all of it, Lena stood exactly where she was, the cloth pressed to her palm, her wrapped hand held against her stomach, and looked at the room with an expression I did not expect. It was not confusion, it was recognition. She knew what was happening. She understood it. She had seen this before, or something so similar that her response was not surprise but protocol. Her body shifted into a posture that I would later learn was deliberately non-threatening by human standards. She lowered her wrapped hand to her side. She opened her other hand, palm out, fingers spread, showing that she held nothing. She took 1 step backward, away from the nearest students, and she stayed there, still and visible, and making no further movement, while the laboratory staff rushed to help the collapsed students. The medical team arrived within minutes. They stabilized the pylori, cleared the Velith, and gently coaxed Creven out of his distress loop. The laboratory was evacuated. Students filed out in clusters, most of them too shocked or confused to do more than follow the evacuation lights toward the nearest common area. Lena walked out last, alone, keeping a deliberate distance between herself and every other body in the corridor. I stayed behind. I do not know why. My antennae were still receiving the traces of iron in the air, and every evolutionary instinct I possessed was telling me to move away from the source. But something else, something that was not instinct, something that might have been the first fragile thread of what my species calls academic curiosity, kept me at the edge of the laboratory door. Through the doorway, I watched one of the medical technicians scan Lena's hand. She stood patiently while the device swept across her palm, and the technician stared at the readout with an expression that I could read even across species lines. It was the face of someone seeing numbers that should not exist. The wound was already clotting. I learned this word later, the human term for what was happening. But in that moment, what I saw on the technician's display was a biological process of stunning speed and efficiency. The cut had been open for less than 4 minutes. In that time, Lena's body had identified the breach in its outer barrier, dispatched specialized cells to the damage site, and begun constructing a temporary seal out of protein fibers and cellular debris. Her blood was literally building a wall across the wound, molecule by molecule, without external intervention, without medical equipment, without her even paying attention to it. The scan also registered her pain response. She was in pain, the wound hurt, but the pain was, according to the device, non-debilitating. Her vital signs showed elevated alertness but no distress. Her musculature was tense but functional. She was injured and aware of it, and continuing to operate at full capacity, because her species had evolved on a world where stopping because you were hurt meant something else would hurt you worse. The medical technician turned to a colleague. I was close enough to catch the words, spoken low, in the clipped tones of professional shock. The report was accurate. They seal while conscious. The white cell mobilization time is faster than a Class 3 battlefield nanite suite. And look at this. The pain signal is present, but it is not triggering a shutdown cascade. The brain is receiving the damage report and choosing to continue normal function. The colleague leaned in. How? The technician looked at Lena, who was thanking them politely for the scan and asking if the 3 students who had collapsed were going to be all right. She asked this with genuine concern. She was worried about them. I have no idea, the technician said, but I am recommending a full biological hazard reclassification for her species before end of day. I went back to my quarters, and I pulled the survey paper up again, the 6 pages of partially redacted information about the planet called Earth. I read it cover to cover twice more. The second time through, I found a section I had skimmed past on my first reading because it had seemed like a footnote, a minor detail buried between paragraphs about atmospheric composition and tectonic frequency. The section was about disease. It explained, in dry academic language, that Earth's biosphere contained an estimated 1 trillion distinct microbial species. 1 trillion. The number was so large that I had to verify the unit conversion twice. These microorganisms existed everywhere on the planet, in the water, in the soil, in the air, inside the bodies of every living creature. Many of them were harmful. Many of them were lethal. And humans, the soft-skinned, blunt-toothed, clawless creatures that had somehow risen to dominance on this world, had survived them not through avoidance, not through environmental control, but through an internal biological warfare system of such staggering complexity that the survey team had dedicated 2 full pages to it before the redaction bars cut the text short. The immune system, they called it. A network of specialized cells that identified foreign organisms inside the body, cataloged their structure, developed targeted countermeasures, and destroyed them. Not once, but continuously, every second of every day, from birth until death. A human body was not a single organism. It was a battlefield, and the war never stopped, and the humans won it so consistently that most of them did not even know it was happening. I closed the document. I sat in the dark of my quarters with my antennae pressed flat against my skull, and I thought about a girl with iron in her blood, and a warfare network inside her body, and a grip strength that shattered laboratory glass. And I tried to understand why anyone would send her to a school full of people who could be brought to the floor by the smell of her. The campus was different after that day, not in any way that would appear on an administrative report or a facilities log, but different in the way that a room changes after you have seen something in the corner that should not have been there. Students gave Lena wider berth in the hallways. Not dramatically, not with the visible avoidance that would have triggered a social inquiry, but the spacing was there, a few extra steps of distance, a pause before entering a lift she was already occupying, conversations that dimmed rather than stopped when she passed, which was somehow worse than silence, because dimming was dishonest. Dorvan was one of the few who did not change his behavior. I watched him approach Lena the following morning before class, his massive frame filling the hallway, and ask her directly if her hand was healing properly. She showed him the adhesive strip, peeled back the edge to reveal the pink line of new tissue already forming beneath it, and he nodded with the stoic acceptance of a species that understood physical damage on a visceral level. Grulax scarred easily and healed slowly. The speed of Lena's recovery was foreign to him, but the concept of being hurt and continuing to function was not. It was, perhaps, the first piece of common ground they had found that was not built on politeness alone. I spent the next 2 evenings in the Academy's restricted archive, accessing everything I could find on human biology that had not been sealed by the Integrations Board. There was not much. A comparative anatomy summary listed human organ systems alongside their galactic equivalents, with most entries marked exceeded standard parameters. A dietary analysis confirmed the omnivore adaptive classification and added a footnote I had not seen before, capable of extracting nutritional value from ethanol, capsaicinoids, and other compounds classified as toxins by galactic biological standards. They could eat poison. Not all poisons, not without limit, but substances that would damage or destroy the digestive systems of most galactic species were processed by human biology as minor irritants or even sources of enjoyment. And there was one more document, a psychological assessment filed by the Integration Program's Behavioral Science Division that evaluated the cognitive profile of the human species. Most of it was predictive modeling and risk analysis, the dry administrative language that institutions produce when they are trying to quantify something that frightens them. But one paragraph near the end was written in plain language, as if the author had abandoned professional detachment and simply said what they were thinking. It read, "The human cognitive architecture is characterized by sustained abstract reasoning combined with a threat processing speed that rivals dedicated combat species. They problem-solve under duress. They improvise tools from environmental materials with minimal preparation time. They form social bonds across species lines with an ease that suggests their empathy response is not limited to their own kind. They can feel fear and continue to act. They can feel pain and continue to think. They can recognize that they are outmatched and choose to engage anyway, not from irrationality, but from a calculated assessment that the cost of inaction exceeds the cost of risk. This combination of traits has no parallel in our current species database." I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I closed the archive and went to bed, and I lay in the dark listening to the hum of the environmental systems and thinking about a girl who could feel fear and act anyway, who could feel pain and think clearly, who could look at something dangerous and calculate whether the risk was worth the cost and make her decision in the space between heartbeats. The next morning I arrived at the lecture hall early. Lena was already there, as she always was, her bag on the floor, her hands folded on the desk, a small adhesive strip on her palm where the cut was already healing beneath it. She looked up when I entered. She smiled that careful, closed-mouth smile. I nodded to her and took my seat 3 rows back, and I realized with a quiet clarity that I was not afraid of her. I was afraid of how much I still did not know about what she was, and how much more there was to learn, and whether the next lesson would be as bloodless as the first. 7 days into Lena Vasik's enrollment, the Academy announced Physical Assessment Day. Every student in every cohort underwent standardized fitness evaluation once per academic quarter. It was routine, it was mandatory. It was, for most species, mildly unpleasant and thoroughly unremarkable. We lined up, performed our tests, received our scores, and went back to our studies with nothing more dramatic than sore muscles and bruised pride. This quarter was different. The equipment had been recalibrated. I noticed it when we filed into the gymnasium, a vast open chamber on the Academy's lower level with testing stations arranged in a circuit around the perimeter. Each station had a display panel showing its current configuration, and as I passed the grip dynamometer on my way to the stretching area, I caught the numbers on its screen. Maximum calibration, Class 8. Last quarter, it had been capped at Class 6. Someone had increased the upper threshold by 2 full classifications, and I did not need to wonder why. Lena arrived with the rest of our cohort, wearing the standard issue athletic clothing that the Academy provided to all species capable of wearing it. On her, it looked almost absurd. The fitted shirt showed arms that were not visibly muscular, at least not by the standards of the heavy gravity species in the room. Her legs were proportional and lean. She looked like exactly what she appeared to be, which was a young female of a small, soft-skinned species that should have ranked somewhere in the lower third of any physical assessment. She looked nervous. She approached the equipment with the cautious body language of someone unfamiliar with the interfaces, asking polite questions of the monitoring staff about how each machine worked, where to stand, which readings to watch. Several students relaxed visibly. Whatever the rumors about the chemistry lab incident had suggested, here was proof that the human was nothing special. She was just a small girl from a newly contacted world, out of her depth in an academy that trained the best students from across the galaxy. Dorvan, standing near the first station with his massive arms crossed over his barrel chest, nudged the Grullock student beside him. "Do not worry," he said, loud enough for the nearby students to hear. "I will go easy on the curve this time." Laughter rippled through the group. Even Lena smiled, a quick flash that might have been genuine amusement, or might have been the reflexive social camouflage of a species that had learned, over millennia of intra-species competition, to appear non-threatening when surrounded by potential rivals. The assessment began. Students rotated through stations in assigned groups. I completed my own tests with the middling scores my species always achieved: adequate reflex times, minimal grip strength, endurance calibrated for a low-gravity origin world. Velesi were not built for physical dominance. We were built for perception, and right now, my perception was locked on the station where Lena Vasic had just stepped up to the grip dynamometer. She placed her hand on the sensor pad. The monitoring staff asked if she was ready. She nodded. She squeezed. The number climbed. It passed Class 2, which was my species' maximum. It passed Class 4, which was the upper range for most avian and insectoid species. It passed Class 5, which was where the midweight species topped out. It reached Class 6, where it should have stopped, where every reasonable prediction, based on her body mass and apparent musculature, said it would stop. It did not stop. The number hit Class 7. The machine registered the reading, and I watched the monitoring staff member look at the display, look at Lena's hand, and look at the display again. Lena released the sensor. She flexed her fingers a few times, as if working out a cramp, and stepped away from the station with the casual air of someone who had just completed a formality. Class 7. The machine was calibrated to top out at Class 8. Class 8 was the grip strength of a Grullock, a species that weighed 400 kilograms and had hands the size of dinner platters. Lena weighed perhaps 60 kilograms. She had hands that could fold closed inside a Grullock's palm, and she had just registered a grip strength one classification below the maximum for a species 6 times her mass. The monitoring staff checked the machine. It was functioning correctly. The second station was reflex measurement. Students stood on a pressure-sensitive platform while random stimuli, light, sound, vibration, were delivered from unpredictable angles, and the platform measured response time in milliseconds. Lena took her position. The test began. Her reaction time was fast. Not the fastest in the room. That distinction went to Tiskal, the Skirith from my chemistry cohort, whose ambush predator neurology gave him a baseline response speed that most species could not match, even with pharmaceutical enhancement. Tiskal hit his stimulus and moved before the light had finished its first pulse. His species was built for the explosive first strike, the fraction of a second lunge that meant the difference between a meal and starvation. But the test ran 50 consecutive trials, and by trial 12, Teskal's times were getting slower. By trial 20, the degradation was visible on the display, each reaction taking a few milliseconds longer than the last, as his specialized neural pathways burned through their chemical reserves and demanded a recovery period. By trial 30, the monitoring staff pulled him off the platform. He was spent. His ambush system had given everything it had and needed time to reload. Lena was still going. Her times were not getting worse. They were holding steady, trial after trial, the same speed, the same precision, 50 times in a row without visible degradation. Her neurology did not burn hot and fast like an ambush predator. It burned steady, consistent, unrelenting. She could react at combat speed for as long as the test chose to run, because her species had not evolved to catch prey in a single burst. They had evolved to catch it over hours, over days, and their reaction time stayed sharp the entire chase, because the chase never ended until they decided it was over. The monitoring staff ended the reflex test early, not because Lena was failing, but because the data was already conclusive and the other students needed the station. Endurance cycling was next, a circular platform that measured sustained cardiovascular output against increasing resistance. Students stepped on, began the motion, and continued until their metabolism hit its wall and their body demanded they stop. This was the test where the heavy species dominated: the Grulak, with their massive oxygen reserves, the Pylori with their dual heart circulatory systems. Small species like mine stepped off early and without shame. We were not built for sustained output. Lena stepped on. She began the cycling motion. Her pace was moderate, unremarkable. In the initial phase, she ranked somewhere in the middle of the cohort, outperformed by the heavy species and several mid-tier endurance specialists. Dorvan was 3 platforms away, churning through the resistance with the raw power of a body that was built to move enormous mass across open terrain. He looked comfortable. He looked dominant. After 8 minutes, the first students began stepping off. The Skirith, unsurprisingly, were among them. Ambush predators had no use for endurance. Their metabolisms peaked fast and crashed hard. After 12 minutes, more dropped. After 18, the midfield thinned. After 22 minutes, Dorvan's pace slowed. His thick hide began to flush darker, the Grulak sign of thermal stress. And at 25 minutes, he stepped off the platform with a grunt that rattled the equipment rack beside him. Lena was still cycling. Her face had changed color. It had gone from its usual pale tone to a deeper pink, trending toward red, and I could see fluid forming on the surface of her skin. Sweat, the files called it, an excretory thermoregulation system that used the evaporation of saline fluid to cool the body during sustained exertion. I watched her skin glisten under the gymnasium lights, and the temperature sensors mounted around her station registered something that made the monitoring staff exchange a look of open disbelief. The air immediately surrounding Lena was measurably cooler than the ambient gymnasium temperature. She was generating her own cooling field. Her body was dumping excess heat through her skin surface so efficiently that she was air conditioning her immediate environment while simultaneously maintaining a cardiovascular output that had already outlasted 80% of the cohort. She cycled for 40 minutes. She did not stop because she reached her limit. She stopped because the monitoring staff ended the test. Every other student had finished. The cohort needed to move to the next station. Lena stepped off the platform, breathing hard, her skin flushed, her clothing damp with the cooling fluid her body had produced, and she looked mildly embarrassed, as if she had committed some social error by continuing longer than everyone else. The environmental stress pod was the final station, a sealed chamber that subjected the occupant to controlled temperature extremes, beginning at species-comfortable baseline and descending toward galactic cold tolerance minimums. Students entered, endured as long as they could, and signaled when they wanted to exit. The pod recorded core temperature, metabolic response, and voluntary termination point. Lena entered the pod. The temperature began to drop. At the point where most warm-blooded species signaled for release, somewhere around 15 degrees below their homeworld average, Lena reported that she was uncomfortable, but fine. The monitoring staff looked at each other. They pushed the temperature lower. Lena began to shiver. I watched through the pod's observation window as her body initiated an involuntary muscular response that I had never seen in any species. Her muscles were contracting and releasing in rapid microcycles. Not large movements, not flailing, just a fine, constant vibration across her entire body. The temperature display inside the pod showed her core reading. It was not dropping, it was holding steady, and in some measurements, it was actually rising. Her body was burning metabolic fuel to generate heat, fighting the external cold with an internal furnace that adjusted its output in real time based on environmental conditions. The monitoring staff pulled her out, not because she asked. She had not asked. They pulled her out because the pod had reached its automated safety threshold, the temperature below which continued exposure was considered a risk for galactic standard biology. Lena stepped out, rubbing her arms, and asked if she had done all right. The scores posted on the wall display 15 minutes later, and the gymnasium went quiet. Lena Vasic had not achieved the highest score in any single category. She was not the strongest. She was not the fastest. She did not have the best reflexes, or the highest cold tolerance, or the greatest raw endurance. In every individual metric, at least one other species in the cohort had outperformed her. But she was in the top 15% in every single category simultaneously. Strength, speed, reflexes, endurance, thermal tolerance, sustained output, recovery time. Every column on the display showed her name in the upper tier. Not the peak, not the best, but always near the top, always competitive, always functional. She had no weakness. Every other species in the room had traded one capability for another: speed for strength, reflexes for endurance, specialization for survival. Lena had traded nothing. She was a generalist of such comprehensive capability that the very concept of a weak point did not seem to apply to her. Dorvan stared at the board. His score was higher than hers in raw strength and short-burst power, but in reflexes, endurance, thermal tolerance, and sustained output, she had beaten him. She had beaten a creature 6 times her mass, in 4 out of 7 categories, and tied him in a 5th. His mouth was open slightly. His neck frill was flat. He did not make another joke. I found Lena in the hallway afterward. She was leaning against the wall with a cloth draped over her neck, wiping the residual sweat from her skin. Her breathing had returned to normal. Her color was settling back to its baseline pale. She looked tired and satisfied, and completely unaware that she had just demonstrated something that no one in the gymnasium had been prepared for. She saw me approaching and straightened up. "Hey," she said. "Rilith, right? You sit behind me in Kavalin's class." I nodded. My antennae were fully extended, reading every chemical and thermal trace her body was producing, and every single one of them was saying the same thing: this organism is still ready. Despite 40 minutes of sustained exertion, despite the cold exposure, despite a full circuit of tests that had exhausted students twice her size, her body was already recovering, already preparing, already operational. "I wanted to ask," she said, and there was something tentative in her voice, something that sounded remarkably like uncertainty. "We have the xenobiology exam in a few days. I am still catching up on the material. Would you want to study together? I mean, if you have time, no pressure." I looked at her. I looked at the hands that could shatter laboratory glass, the body that could outrun every species in the cohort, the biology that healed itself, and cooled itself, and fought off 1 trillion microorganisms every second of every day. And she was asking me if I wanted to study together, with the nervous energy of someone who was afraid I might say no. "Yes," I said. "I have time." She smiled. The full one this time, not the careful closed-mouth version she used in crowds. This one showed teeth, just briefly, just a flash of white enamel that my hindbrain registered as a threat display, and my forebrain overrode with conscious effort. I walked away and told myself that I was helping a classmate, that this was academic collaboration, nothing more, that I was not walking towards something my entire evolutionary history was screaming at me to run from. I told myself many things that evening. Most of them were lies. The xenobiology exam came and went. Lena scored in the upper quartile, her answers thorough and well-structured, her understanding of multi-species biological systems surprisingly deep for someone who had been on campus for barely 2 weeks. We had studied together twice, once in the library and once in the dining hall after hours, and I had learned something about her that the fitness scores and the blood chemistry and the grip strength readings had not revealed. She was curious, not in the passive, receptive way of species that absorbed information because their schooling required it. Curious in an active, forward-leaning way, the way a hunter tracks a trail, following each piece of knowledge to the next, with an intensity that was simultaneously endearing and unsettling. She asked questions that made me reconsider things I had accepted as settled. She connected concepts across disciplines, pulling a principle from chemistry into a biological framework, and then extending it into a hypothesis about planetary ecology with a fluidity that suggested her brain did not recognize the boundaries between subjects. During our second study session, she told me about the concept humans called food chains. On most worlds, the ecological hierarchy was a simple vertical structure: Producers at the bottom, primary consumers above them, secondary consumers above those, and so on, with each layer being fewer in number and more specialized. On Earth, Lena explained, the food web was not a chain at all. It was a tangle. Predators ate other predators. Prey species evolved to become predators of their former predators' young. Parasites hijacked the nervous systems of host organisms and drove them to suicidal behaviors that benefited the parasite's reproductive cycle. Fungi dissolved living organisms from the inside and repurposed their biomass. The entire biosphere was a churning engine of consumption and adaptation. Every organism locked in an arms race with every other organism. Every survival strategy met with a counter-strategy. Every defense met with a new attack. Nothing was stable. Nothing was safe. Everything was in motion, all the time, and the only constant was that the organisms that stopped adapting were the organisms that stopped existing. I asked her, carefully, whether humans were at the top of this web. She thought about it for a moment, tilting her head in a gesture I was learning to recognize as her processing face. We are now, she said, but not because we were always there. We started in the middle. We were prey for a long time. Big cats, wolves, crocodiles, birds of prey, they all ate us. We survived because we were clever and because we worked together, but we died in large numbers. Children, especially. The predators took the children. She said this with a flatness that made my antennae curl, not because the words were delivered without emotion, but because they were delivered with the particular kind of controlled emotion that comes from a species that has processed a trauma so ancient and so deep that it has become foundational. The predators took the children. That single sentence explained more about human psychology than the entire restricted archive I had spent 2 nights reading. I was beginning to understand what made humans truly dangerous. It was not the grip strength, or the endurance, or the iron blood. It was the mind behind all of it, a cognitive engine that never stopped processing, never stopped asking, never stopped reaching for the next piece of understanding. Evolution had given them a body that could survive anything. Then it had given them a brain that wanted to know everything. The combination was, in retrospect, inevitable. The following week brought smaller revelations. I learned that Lena could hold her breath for over 2 minutes, a fact that emerged during a routine atmospheric safety drill when she failed to put on her emergency respirator within the required window, and the monitoring system flagged her as a casualty. Only to discover she was standing calmly in the vacuum simulation corridor, with her lungs sealed and her metabolic rate deliberately slowed. The drill supervisor stared at her readouts for a full 30 seconds before clearing her. I learned that she could sleep in intervals, not the mandatory 8 to 10 hour continuous rest cycle that most galactic species required, but in short bursts of varying length, distributing her recovery time across the day in a pattern she called napping. She could be fully alert, lie down, lose consciousness for 20 minutes, and wake up refreshed and functional. The first time she did this in the library during our study break, I spent the entire 20 minutes watching her vital signs on my antennae, convinced something was medically wrong, before she opened her eyes, stretched, and asked where we had left off. I learned that she could cry, not the distress vocalization that most species produced under extreme duress, but a quiet, controlled emission of saline fluid from her eyes that accompanied a range of emotional states, not just pain or fear, but also happiness, frustration, nostalgia, and what she described as being moved. The first time I saw it happen, during a lecture about the extinction of the Polleni species and the memorial efforts that followed, I reached for the emergency medical alert on my desk before she stopped me with a gentle hand on my arm and whispered that she was fine, that this was normal, that humans did this when something mattered to them. Everything about her was impossible, and everything about her was real. 3 weeks into the semester, on a gray afternoon when the sky beyond the Academy's atmospheric dome was heavy with low clouds, the alarm hit during third period lecture. It was not a drill alarm. I knew the difference immediately, because drill alarms pulsed in regular intervals and triggered a measured, procedural response from the students and staff. This alarm was continuous. It was a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the walls and floor, a frequency specifically calibrated to activate the threat recognition pathways of every species on campus simultaneously. My antennae flared to full extension. Around me, students stiffened in their seats. Professor Kovilan stopped mid-sentence, his expression shifting from teaching mode to something I had never seen on him before. The building intelligence system spoke through the overhead channels. Its voice was the flat, precise tone that all emergency systems used, stripped of personality, designed for maximum information transfer in minimum time. Unauthorized biological hazard detected in the Eastern Bio-Research Wing. Classification: active predatory fauna, uncontained. Species identification: Corvathi stalker, single adult specimen. All personnel initiate shelter protocol. Security response estimated at 11 minutes. The words settled over the room like a physical weight. Around me, students began the shelter procedure, moving to the reinforced interior corners of the lecture hall, pulling emergency barriers from their wall-mounted housings, clustering in tight groups. Some were calm, some were shaking. A Pelori girl in the third row was crying without sound, her chemoreceptor tendrils coiled tight against her skull. I knew what a Corvathi stalker was. We had studied them in second-year xenobiology. They were mid-tier ambush predators from a Class 6 world, roughly 40 kilograms, built low and fast with a silhouette designed to slip through narrow spaces. They hunted by thermal signature, their heat-sensing organs capable of tracking warm-blooded prey through walls and floors. They struck from concealment with a speed that gave most species no time to react. Their primary weapon was a tail-mounted array of venomous spines, hollow keratin structures that delivered a paralytic compound on contact. A single spine was enough to immobilize a grulak for 6 hours. For a smaller species like mine, the venom would stop autonomous respiratory function within minutes. The Bio-Research Wing was one corridor away from the academic building. The connecting passage was a straight hallway, 40 meters long, with no security barriers between the two structures. If the Corvathi had entered the connector, it was functionally inside our building. Students huddled. Some prayed in their native traditions. Dorvan positioned himself at the front of the largest group, his massive body a physical barrier, his hands clenched into fists that could crack stone but would be useless against a creature that struck before you could see it. Security was 11 minutes away. The Corvathi could cover 40 meters in under 3 seconds. Lena stood up. She did not stand up quickly. She did not jump to her feet or make any sudden movement. She simply rose from her seat with the same quiet, fluid motion she used for everything. And she stood in the aisle between the seating rows, looking at the sealed door of the lecture hall, and her expression was one I had not seen on her before. It was not fear. I knew what fear looked like on humans now. I had seen a flicker of it during the cold tolerance test, a tightening around the eyes, a slight elevation in breathing rate. This was not that. This was something colder and older, something that lived beneath the surface of her polite smiles and study group conversations and nervous laughter. Her eyes were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her hands, the same hands that had shattered a Class 6 pipette without trying, hung loose at her sides with the relaxed readiness of something that did not need to clench to be dangerous. She spoke without turning around. Her voice was calm and level, and she directed her words at the room without raising them. "How big is it?" Nobody answered for a moment. Then I spoke, because I was the only one whose voice was working. Approximately 40 kilograms, low build, fast in short distances. It tracks by thermal signature. Venomous? Tail-mounted spines, paralytic compound. One hit is enough for most species. Lena nodded. She reached down and took her jacket from her seat, a thick outer layer of woven fabric, and wrapped it around her left forearm in tight, overlapping layers. She wound it until the arm was padded from wrist to elbow, a crude but functional barrier. Then she walked to the nearest workstation table, the kind with integrated equipment racks, and gripped one of the metal support struts that connected the tabletop to its base frame. She pulled, and the metal bent. She adjusted her grip and pulled again, and the strut separated from the frame with a sound of tearing composite. She held it up, tested its weight, adjusted her hand position along its length. It was roughly a meter long and as thick as 2 of her fingers pressed together. A metal rod, improvised, imperfect, functional. She walked toward the sealed lecture hall door. "Vasek." Professor Kovalin's voice cut across the room. The building is in lockdown. That door is magnetically sealed. You cannot open it, and you should not attempt to. Lena stopped at the door and looked at the control panel beside it. She studied it for 2 seconds, then reached up and pried the panel's cover off with her fingernails. Behind it was the manual override mechanism, a physical failsafe built into every door on campus in case of electronic system failure. She reached in, found the release lever, and disengaged the magnetic lock with a precise, deliberate motion. The door opened. Red emergency lighting filled the corridor beyond, casting everything in a deep crimson wash. The hallway stretched ahead, straight and unbroken, toward the connector passage that led to the bio-research wing. Lena stepped through the door and into the corridor, alone, with a metal rod in one hand and a jacket wrapped around the other, and the door closed behind her. For 5 seconds, nobody in the lecture hall moved. Then Dorvan lunged for the wall-mounted security display and activated the corridor camera feed. We watched. The feed was tinted red from the emergency lighting, but the resolution was sharp enough to see everything. Lena moved down the corridor at a walking pace, not running, not creeping, walking, with the measured, forward stride of someone crossing a room to answer a door. Her head was up, her eyes were scanning, that predator sweep, left to right, checking corners and doorways, and the shadows between emergency light panels. The metal rod was held low at her right side, angled slightly forward. Her wrapped left arm was raised to chest height, presented forward like a shield. She reached the connector passage. Through the camera at the junction point, I could see into the far end of the hallway, and there, crouched against the base of the wall in a pool of deeper shadow, was the Korvathi stalker. It was exactly as the textbooks described, low-slung, compact, its limbs folded beneath a body covered in mottled dark plating that shifted color to match its surroundings. Its heat-sensing organs, 2 deep pits set into the front of its skull, were oriented directly at Lena. It had already seen her. It had been tracking her thermal signature since she entered the corridor. The tail was raised behind it, the venomous spine array fanned open like a crown of needles. Lena saw it at the same moment it decided to charge. The Korvathi exploded forward, covering 10 meters in less than a second, its clawed feet gripping the floor with a sound like tearing cloth. It was fast, genuinely, terrifyingly fast, faster than anything I had seen outside of simulation footage. Lena did not run, she did not flinch, she did not freeze. She shifted her weight onto her back foot, pivoted her hips, and sidestepped. Not with panic, not with desperate, adrenaline-fueled clumsiness, with timing. The kind of timing that comes from a nervous system that has been running combat calculations since before the conscious mind registered the threat. The kind that comes from a species that spent 100,000 years facing things with claws and teeth and venom and survived every single encounter because their brain could process a charge trajectory and compute an evasion vector in the time it took their heart to beat once. The Korvathi passed through the space where she had been standing. Its claws scraped the floor. It began to turn. Lena brought the metal rod down on the back of its skull. The impact was precise, controlled. She did not swing wildly. She did not flail. She targeted the junction between the skull plate and the first cervical segment, the point of maximum neurological disruption, and she hit it with exactly enough force to stagger the creature without killing it outright. The Korvathi stumbled. Its coordination broke. Its legs splayed, and its tail swung in a reflexive defensive arc, the spine array slashing through the air toward Lena's midsection. The spines hit the jacket wrapped around her left forearm. I heard the impact through the security feed audio, a rapid series of thuds, hard and sharp. The fabric held. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough. The venomous tips penetrated 2 of the outer layers, but did not reach skin. Lena grabbed the tail below the spine cluster, her bare hand closing around the base of the appendage, and she held it still. The Korvathi thrashed, 40 kilograms of panicked predator, trying to wrench its primary weapon free from a grip that should not have been able to hold it. Lena's arm tensed. The muscles in her forearm stood out beneath her skin like cables, and she held the tail immobile while she brought the metal rod down a second time, and a third. The Korvathi went limp, not dead, stunned. Its limbs twitched with residual neural activity, But the coordinated predatory response was broken. It lay on the corridor floor in the red emergency light, and Lena released its tail and stepped back, breathing hard, the metal rod held ready in case it got up again. It did not get up. Lena turned from the downed predator and moved further up the corridor. The camera feed tracked her as she reached a figure slumped against the wall near the bio-wing entrance, a laboratory technician, one of the Tavellan staff, who had been caught in the corridor when the Corvathi breached containment. He was conscious but injured, a deep laceration across his upper thorax where the creature had struck him during its initial escape. He was losing fluid, his coloring was bad. Lena dropped to her knees beside him. She pressed her hands against the wound, bare skin against alien flesh, and applied pressure. She spoke to him in a steady, low voice, words I could not make out through the feed audio but whose tone was unmistakable. Calm, reassuring, present. She kept pressure on the wound with one hand, and used the other to check his vital responses, tilting his head, monitoring his breathing, keeping him conscious and oriented. She stayed like that for 9 minutes, kneeling in the red light beside an injured alien, holding his wound closed with her bare hands, until the security team arrived. The squad came through the connector at full tactical speed, 6 armed personnel in containment armor. The squad leader stopped 3 paces from the scene and took it in. A stunned Corvathi stalker on the floor, a stabilized patient with improvised wound compression, and a human girl, her jacket torn, her hands covered in Tavellan blood, looking up at them with the calm, focused expression of someone who had finished one task and was ready to hand off to the next. The squad leader looked at the Corvathi, looked at Lena, looked at the metal rod on the floor beside her. You took down a Corvathi stalker with a furniture strut. Lena looked at the creature on the floor. It was only 40 kilograms, she said, as if that explained everything. The security team secured the Corvathi, sedated it, and extracted the technician for proper medical treatment. Lena was escorted back to the academic building. When she walked back into the lecture hall, every student in the room was standing, not because anyone had told them to, because sitting felt wrong. Her hands were shaking. I noticed it immediately, the fine tremor running through her fingers, visible even from across the room. It was not fear. I knew enough now to know what it was. Her body had deployed a chemical called adrenaline, a combat hormone that enhanced strength, speed, pain tolerance, and reaction time for the duration of a threat. Now that the threat was over, the hormone was metabolizing out of her system, and the withdrawal was producing involuntary tremor. It was a crash after a peak, a biological weapon powering down after deployment. I had read about adrenaline in the survey paper. The section had been partially redacted, but the visible portion had included a single line that I now understood in full context. It read, "The adrenal response is self-reinforcing. Repeated activation increases efficiency of deployment and reduces cognitive resistance to threat engagement." In simple terms, the more they fought, the better they got at fighting, and the less it bothered them. That evening, the Academy's Central Species Classification Database updated. I watched the change appear on the Public Information Terminal, in the Student Commons, the field next to Earth, refreshing from pending review, to a new designation in bright alert coloring. Class 12 Deathworld. I stared at those words. Class 12 was not a number I had seen applied to any world in the Academy's records. The scale, as I understood it, ran to Class 10 for the most hostile environments capable of producing sapient life. Class 12 was beyond the established range. Someone had extended the scale to accommodate what Earth was. Lena's student profile updated at the same time. A single new line appeared beneath her course enrollment and residential assignment. Integration Risk Assessment, revised. I did not know what revised meant in administrative terms, but I knew what it meant in practical ones. It meant that the people who had sent Lena Vasic to this academy were reconsidering whether that had been a good idea, and the answer was no longer obvious. She sat alone in the dining hall that evening, as she often did, eating her meal with the quiet self-sufficiency of someone who had long since stopped expecting company. I watched her from 4 tables away, and thought about the corridor, the red light, the moment she had sidestepped a charging predator, with the unhurried precision of someone stepping aside to let another pedestrian pass. She had not fought the Corvathi because she was brave. Bravery implied the presence of fear, and the decision to act despite it. I had watched her face on the security feed, and I had seen her vital readings on the playback data that the security team made available to the academic staff afterward. Her heart rate had elevated, her adrenal response had activated, but the fear centers of her brain, the regions that should have triggered a flight response, a freeze response, anything that prioritized self-preservation over forward engagement, had not activated at all. She had not been brave, she had been operational. Her species did not process a 40-kilogram predator as a threat, requiring courage to confront. They processed it as a problem requiring a solution. The courage was not necessary, because the fear was not sufficient. On a world where everything was trying to kill you from the moment you were born, a world where the predators were bigger and the diseases were deadlier, and the environment itself was trying to crush you under twice the galaxy's standard gravity, you either learned to walk toward the danger, or you did not survive long enough to pass on your genes. Lena Vasic was the product of a world that had spent 4 billion years trying to kill everything on it, and everything on it had spent 4 billion years getting better at surviving. The humans had won that arms race. They had won it so completely that a teenage girl could take a Korvathi stalker with a piece of furniture and describe it as manageable because, by the standards of her homeworld, it was. I thought about this for a long time. Then I stood up, picked up my tray, carried it across the dining hall, and sat down across from her. She looked up from her food. Her expression shifted through several stages in rapid succession: surprise, caution, hope. She settled on cautious hope, which was, I was beginning to learn, her default emotional state. A creature capable of overpowering everything in the room, hoping that someone would choose to sit with her. "Hey," she said. "Hello," I said. We ate in silence for a while. It was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two organisms occupying shared space without demand, the kind of quiet that does not need to be filled. Eventually I spoke. The question had been building in me since the first day, since the moment she appeared in the doorway without displacing the air. And I had carried it through chemistry labs and fitness assessments, and a predator encounter, and 2 study sessions, and I could not carry it any further. "What are you?" She put down her utensil. She looked at me directly, and for a moment, the polite social layer dropped away, and I saw something behind it that was neither threatening nor gentle. It was simply real, unfiltered. The face of a creature that did not need camouflage but wore it anyway, because the alternative was loneliness. "I am a human," she said. "I am 16 standard years old. I am from a city called Volgograd on a planet called Earth. I enjoy mathematics, and I am terrible at visual art, and I miss my home sometimes." She paused. "But I know that is not what you are asking." "No," I said. "It is not." She nodded. She did not look offended. She looked, if anything, relieved, as if she had been waiting for someone to ask, and the waiting had been worse than the question. "Earth is a world where everything is trying to kill everything else," she said. "All the time. It has been that way for longer than most civilizations in the galaxy have existed. The organisms there do not cooperate with their environment. They compete against it. Everything alive on Earth is alive because it was better at surviving than the things that tried to eat it, or infect it, or crush it, or freeze it, or starve it. Nothing is given. Everything is taken. And humans, my species, we did not win by being the strongest, or the fastest, or the most venomous. We were never any of those things." "Then how did you win?" I asked. She looked at me with those forward-facing predator eyes, and for the first time, I noticed something in them that I had been too distracted by the danger to see before. Depth. Not the flat calculation of a hunting organism tracking prey, but the layered, complex depth of a mind that carried the weight of its own history and felt every kilogram of it. "We never stopped," she said. "That is the answer. That is the only answer. We never stopped. When we were hungry, we chased things. Not in bursts, not in sprints. We followed them. We followed them when they ran, and we followed them when they hid. And we followed them across deserts and up mountains and through rivers that could have drowned us. We followed them until they could not run anymore. Because every other predator on our world could outrun us in a straight line, but none of them, not one, could run forever. We just kept going. Mile after mile, hour after hour, day after day, until the thing we were chasing fell down because its body surrendered, and then we ate it. She said this without pride, without shame, with the flat, factual delivery of someone describing weather. We broke bones and kept walking, she continued. We got sick, and our bodies learned the sickness and destroyed it from the inside. We ate anything we could find, plants, animals, insects, fungi, things that were poisonous to every other species on the planet. We ate them, and our bodies figured out how to process them, and we kept going. We adapted to deserts and ice fields and jungles and open ocean. We climbed to the tops of mountains where the air was too thin to breathe, and lived there. We dove into water so deep the pressure should have crushed us, and came back up. We did all of this before we invented the first tool. She paused. She picked up a piece of the food on her tray, a strip of cooked animal tissue, and held it up. This is muscle. From an animal that was raised on a farm on a station somewhere in this system. On Earth, my ancestors would have chased this animal's equivalent across open plains for 3 days, until it collapsed from exhaustion, and then they would have eaten it raw, with their bare hands, sitting in the dirt, and they would have been grateful, because it meant they survived another week. She put the food down. And then we made tools. We threw rocks until we learned to sharpen them. We sharpened them until we learned to attach them to sticks. We made spears and then bows, and then metals, and then explosives, and then weapons that could crack a planet open from orbit. Every single step, from the first thrown rock to the last warhead, was the same instinct, the same drive. Find the problem, solve the problem, survive. We never stopped improving because we never felt safe. Because on Earth, you are never safe. Something is always coming. Something is always hunting. And if you stop moving, stop thinking, stop adapting, even for a moment, you die. She tapped her own chest with her knuckle, a light, hollow sound against bone covered by soft tissue. Every human alive carries all of that, all of it. The chase instinct, the fight chemistry, the healing, the endurance, the adaptability. It is all still in here, inside every single one of us. Even the ones who have never run a day in their lives. 16-year-old girls from Volgograd who like math and cannot draw. We are all carrying 4 billion years of survival pressure in our cells, and it never switches off. It just waits. The dining hall was empty around us. The overhead lights had dimmed to their evening setting. Somewhere in the distance, a maintenance drone hummed through its nightly route. Lena's words sat between us like something physical, heavy, and real. I asked the question that had been building inside me since the morning I read her species file, and could not sleep. Then why are you here? Why send a predator to a school full of prey? Her expression changed. The factual flatness dropped away, and what replaced it was something I had not expected and was not prepared for. It was not anger or defensiveness or the cold calculation of a hunter justifying its presence. It was pain. Old, quiet, bone-deep pain, the kind that lives so far inside you that you forget it is there until someone asks the right question, and it surfaces all at once. Because we do not want to be predators anymore, she said, and her voice cracked on the word, anymore, just slightly, just enough to hear. We have been alone on our world for 200,000 years. 200,000 years with nothing but other predators for company. Everything else either ran from us or tried to kill us, and we overcame it every time, and it did not make us happy. It just made us alone. She looked at her hands, the hands that could bend metal and crush glass and hold a thrashing predator's tail immobile. She turned them over and studied her palms as if seeing them for the first time. We made it out, she said. We looked up at the stars and we built the things we needed to reach them, and we left our world, and the first thing we found, the very first thing, was a galaxy full of species who take one look at us and start shaking, who smell our blood and pass out, who watch us move and see a predator wearing a person's shape. And I understand it. I do. I know what I am. I know what my body is built for. I know that when that thing was running at me in the corridor, my first instinct was not to run. My first instinct was to count its legs, and calculate its turning radius, and figure out where to hit it. I know that is not normal. I know that is not what your species does when something with claws is charging at you. She met my eyes again. But I am here. I am here because someone has to be the first one to sit in the chair and eat lunch and fail the art exam and prove that the monster is just a girl. Someone has to be the first human that the rest of the galaxy meets, who does not come carrying a weapon or flying a warship or negotiating a treaty from a position of implied force. Someone has to just be a student, just a person, just someone who wants to study for the xenobiology exam, and maybe have one friend who does not look at her and see a Deathworld predator wearing a schoolgirl's skin. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The saline fluid I had learned about, the crying response, was forming at the edges of her lower lids, catching the low light of the dining hall in thin, bright lines. She was not making the distress sounds that accompanied crying in its extreme form. This was the quiet version, the one that happened when something mattered too much to keep inside, but not enough to break through the walls she had built around herself, over 16 years of being the thing that everything else was afraid of. My mother cried when I left, she said, and the shift in subject was so sudden that my antennae twitched. Not because she was sad, because she was proud. She told me that I was going to change things, that someday an alien child would read about the first human in a galactic school, and they would not think predator. They would think classmate. She told me it would be hard, and that I would be lonely, and that there would be days when I wanted to come home so badly that my chest would ache with it. And she was right about all of it. But she also told me something else. She said that every bridge in history was built by someone who was willing to stand in the middle of it, while both sides decided whether to cross. She looked at me with those wet, impossible eyes. I am standing in the middle, Rilith, and I am so tired. But I am still standing. Silence. Long, full, heavy silence. I looked at her across the table. I looked at the face that hid an apex predator's neurology, the eyes that tracked like a hunter's, the body that ran on iron-rich blood and combat hormones, and an immune system that waged a ceaseless biological war against 1,000,000,000,000 microscopic enemies, the hands that could kill, and the voice that cracked when she talked about loneliness, the creature that had walked into a corridor alone to fight something dangerous, not because she was fearless, but because she could not sit in a room and listen to other people be afraid, while she had the power to make it stop. I reached across the table and opened my xenobiology textbook. I turned it so the pages faced her and slid it forward until it rested between us. "The exam is in 2 days," I said. "You said you wanted to study." She stared at the textbook, then at me. Her eyes, those predator eyes with their precise, terrifying focus, went wide. Her mouth opened and closed and opened again. For 5 full seconds, the most dangerous organism I had ever encountered could not find a single word to say. Then she smiled. Not the careful one. Not the closed-mouthed diplomatic version she wore in classrooms and hallways, and every other space where she was performing the role of a harmless visitor. This was the real one. Full and open and bright, and yes, I saw the teeth. The flat grinding surfaces backed by the pointed canines that her species used to tear meat from bone, and my hindbrain screamed, and my forebrain said quiet, and I did not flinch. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome," I said. Now open to Chapter 9. Your understanding of multi-cardiac circulatory redundancy was incorrect on 3 points in our last session, and I do not intend to let you embarrass me by association on the final assessment. She laughed. A real laugh, sudden and warm, and the sound of it filled the empty dining hall the way her arrival had filled the classroom doorway 3 weeks ago. Without warning, without precedent, without anything in my experience to prepare me for how it would feel. We studied until the lights dimmed to their overnight setting, and the maintenance drones began their full cleaning cycle. She walked me to the residential wing, our footsteps side by side in the quiet corridor, hers still nearly silent, and mine tapping in the quick, light Valesi rhythm. At the junction where our paths diverged, she paused. "Rilith? Yes?" "In the corridor. With the Korvathi. Were you scared?" I considered the question. I was not in the corridor. "I know. But were you scared for me?" I thought about it. About the moment she had stepped through the door, alone, into the red light. About the raw, breathless seconds watching the security feed. about the grip of my own antennae against my skull, pressed flat in the posture my species had carried since before we had language, the posture that meant something is wrong and I cannot stop it. Yes, I said. I was terrified. She nodded slowly. Good, she said, and there was something ancient in the word, something that came from a place deeper than 16 years, and farther away than a city called Volgograd. That means it mattered. She turned and walked away down the corridor. I watched her go, quiet, soft-footed, the overhead lights catching the dark brown of her hair and the pale curve of her neck and the slight, lingering tremor in her hands that she thought I could not see, but that I felt through the floor with every step. She walks like silence, and bleeds iron, and broke a predator's skull with a chair leg before third period ended. Her world tried to kill her every day of her evolutionary history, and she answered it by becoming the most adaptable, most relentless, most unkillable thing in the known galaxy. She sits next to me in xenobiology, and asks to borrow my notes, and worries about her art grade, and misses her home, and laughs at jokes that are not funny, because she is so grateful someone is telling them to her. A Deathworld predator wears her skin, but underneath the predator, underneath the iron blood, and the pursuit hunter stamina, and the combat hormones, and the immune system that fights a war inside her body every second she breathes, there is a girl who crossed the galaxy because she was tired of being feared. A girl who sat in a dining hall alone for 3 weeks because she would rather eat in silence than watch one more person recoil from the smell of her. A girl who walked into a dark corridor with a piece of furniture because she could not bear the sound of other people's fear when she had the means to end it. She is the most dangerous thing I have ever met, and she is my friend. And I think, when the histories are written, and the galaxy looks back on the day it first met the species from the Class 12 world that should not have produced anything but monsters, the thing they will remember is not the iron blood, or the grip strength, or the predator that fell to a schoolgirl with a metal rod. The thing they will remember is that she asked to borrow my notes, and I said yes, and neither of us flinched.